This is Kelly Ritch, and I am really excited to welcome our guests today to our discussion. So our guests, would you be willing to spend a few minutes and just tell us a little bit about your background?
Absolutely. Thank you for this opportunity, Kelly. Again, by way of introduction, Starling. I'm the founder and CEO of Reveles Clinical Services. And Reveles is a very purposeful technology-enabled clinical research company that is enabling patients with rare and complex diseases to participate in clinical trials in the comfort of their home. We do so by leveraging commercially available integrated technology and decentralized clinical trial services so that patients that are, again, willing to participate in clinical trials, their procedures, their clinical procedures, the data, the investigational product administration, all of the very meaningful activities that are traditionally done in the site can now be done safely and efficaciously in the home.
Yeah, I can see that that's even more important these days, right? Maybe you can tell our audience just a little bit more about what inspired you to really kick this off and build this type of CRO.
Well, interesting enough, I firmly believe that every blessing has a backstory, and my backstory is a little spiritual for me. It was, the need that really was crystallized for me from a personal experience. I have a mother who had spent roughly about a 2-year odyssey of navigating the complexities around ultimately being diagnosed with a rare disease. In my capacity in a past life professionally, I was responsible for the clinical research business that provided investigational product services and distribution and supply chain for clinical trials. And so naturally, during the actual diagnosis process, we're excited to receive a diagnosis, but only to be met with frustration to learn that there actually wasn't any treatment, which is not uncommon for rare disease patients, with nearly 95% of them not having FDA-approved treatment. So during that particular situation with the physician engaged and the healthcare practitioners engaged, I asked, well, clearly, perhaps maybe there's a clinical trial. And at that moment, she did not know, but we left that appointment and ultimately decided to do some research to see if there was a potential clinical trial that my mother could participate in. There actually was. When we started to do our research and ultimately discovered there was a clinical trial. However, the actual trials were not here locally. And that really set me out on this journey because we were really frustrated that we had, my mom, which was definitely interested and willing and able to participate, but the clinical trials were not accessible to her. And so, interesting enough, Reveles is a congruence of my professional experiences. Again, as I shared, I ran the clinical research business for very large organization. And then prior to that, I had oversight over home infusion specialty pharmacies in which we did provide clinical research in the home. So I have, essentially combined those experiences to launch, again, a very purposeful organization, which is Reveles Clinical Services.
Yeah, you can definitely see the passion you have. And I can tell that, having that tie to your family would be great motivation. Likely much of our audience is really familiar with the traditional CRO. Do you think that you could highlight the key differences? Because I think those differences might help us further talk about decentralized trials. In what ways are you specifically different than the traditional CRO people are familiar with?
Absolutely. Well, first and foremost, we like to in kind joke about the fact that we are a different CRO in the fact that we are a collaborative research organization. It's certainly something that, we aim as a part of our competitive advantage is how we engage and really with an emphasis on collaboration and high-touch services, both from a patient services as well as a customer engagement. But as you think about your traditional CROs that are providing outsourced services, we are an organization that is hyper-focused and specializing in hybrid decentralized clinical trial approaches. And we are an organization, again, that has a singular focus on providing an end-to-end solution for decentralized clinical trials so that patients that have often not had access to these clinical trials through the advent of decentralized clinical trials and integrated technology, they can participate.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm sure as you've kind of pushed into this space, which is relatively new to many, you've faced challenges along the way. Could you talk a little bit about some of the main challenges and how Reveles has met those?
Yeah, well, I think there's certainly, I think there's industry challenges and there's operational challenges, but I do want to take a moment to highlight some of the, I think, kind of industry challenges. And I think first and foremost, what we've experienced in 2020 with the global pandemic, COVID-19, has truly illuminated the opportunity for decentralized clinical trials. The general philosophy and opinions of pharma, clinical development leaders in 2008 and early 2009 was decentralized clinical trials were nice to do someday. And the general attitude was, tell me why I need it. And we understand and recognize most of, all of the advantages. However, there really wasn't a real need to adopt the decentralized clinical trials. However, last year we've seen, at the beginning of this year, we've seen obviously, an unprecedented time with, COVID-19, where many of the sites are inaccessible. Patients are being encouraged to stay at home and to practice social distancing. And so this event, this global event, has truly illuminated the fact that decentralized clinical trials does provide a mechanism for the continuation of clinical trial activities for patients to be able to engage in clinical trials in the comfort of their home. And so one of the major challenges is an industry with change management. I think we see that, there is a general just misunderstanding of decentralized clinical trials. And this is largely because there's inconsistency in the nomenclature. Mm-hmm. If you Google decentralized clinical trials, you'll see remote, you'll see virtual trials, you'll see hybrid, you'll see siteless, you'll see direct to patient. And I think one major effort to help try to move us as an industry towards alignment was aligning on a consistent nomenclature. And so there have been some focused organizations, the FDA and a few other organizations have strongly encouraged us to align on consistent nomenclature. And so decentralized clinical trials is what we have been encouraged to reference this model. And so change management, understanding what is needed to move forward, educating industry internally on what is needed around the different elements and aspects of decentralized clinical trials is certainly some are major challenges. And the other pieces, you think about the infrastructure that is needed to move and migrate to a successful decentralized clinical trial. Many organizations have these monolithic systems that are they're inflexible, they're hard to kind of pivot, and so what you're finding is the organizations that are really moving forward with helping spur adoption in our industry are having platforms that are either integrated or fully platforms that are fully dedicated to decentralized purpose-built platforms. And so these solutions often are not aligned with the traditional solutions that have supported the traditional clinical trials. So I think first and foremost, change management is certainly a major challenge that the industry faced, but it's not insurmountable. I think, looking at technology infrastructure, education, SOP adoption, those are some major considerations that I would, strongly offer up as insights.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's some of the motivation for ArcheMedX to launch this interview series, is just really recognizing the difficulties facing us because of the pandemic, but also the forcing function that it offers for innovation, right? Because like you said, those traditional, why should I try this? What's kind of in it for me is gone. And there really is that like immediate pressure to move off of some of the old paradigms. So, we're eager to have those conversations and, like you said, get the word out about the different nomenclatures and help people really demystify what all of these pieces mean, and adopt them as quickly as possible so that we can bring real positive change, to patients. So I love and appreciate your mission. So we talk about it a little bit, and you've hit on it even with your family's backstory. But let's just really dig into it more directly. The idea that we see it even in the COVID vaccines. We know we need strong minority representation in order to have strong data sets and data sets that we can trust. But despite knowing that and even talking about it more directly now, we don't see it in the numbers. We're still struggling to see it in the numbers. So from your perspective, how can we enroll and ensure minority representation across clinical trial research?
Absolutely. And again, I think this speaks to one of the considerations around how we're differentiated as than a traditional CRO. Reveles has actually made it, our social mission to really invest and to make a commitment as an organization, enterprise-wide, to really focus on what role we can play in addressing some of the many barriers that prevent ethnic minorities and underserved communities from participating in clinical trials. We do understand that there actually is a very long history of our industry really trying to tackle this. There's been a lot of pressure from industry stakeholders to request that our regulatory bodies to impose more policy changes that would require certain elements of I would say requirements for diversity in clinical trials and recruitment rates. So I think that certainly is something as an industry we've been talking about for quite some time. I do want to take an opportunity to underscore, one of the things that makes, getting, people of color, ethnic minorities to participate in clinical trials. It is not one singular issue. There are so many things that need to be, carefully managed to help increase enrollment and engagement. But I want to underscore that one of the most meaningful considerations is the fact that people of color, ethnic minorities, African American, Black, have had a history that warrants mistrust, not only from a medical community, but there's also a general societal mistrust. And so that has created a barrier that, again, is insurmountable, but it takes time. And so you take what we are experiencing with the COVID trials, with operational warp speed, and you try to combine the need to accelerate the process, but the fact that developing those relationships, getting into those communities, educating and bringing awareness about the importance of clinical trials, that takes time. And that time needs to be well spent with those communities so that they are willing to participate. Because there's a difference between willingness and the fact that there actually is a history of mistrust. Mm-hmm. Many patients are willing, but we have to get them to a place where they understand what their, what their rights are. They understand what the value of clinical research and ultimately the importance of having proper and adequate representation in clinical trials, particularly in, therapies or disease group or therapeutic focuses where those patients are disproportionately, impacted.
Absolutely. Sometimes I think it can help if people can envision like a user story or a success story, a patient profile of somebody who is benefiting from decentralized trials. Is that something that you have and that you could share? Like, what is a profile of a potential patient who traditionally may not have participated, but because of decentralized trials is that you could share with the audience?
Yeah, I mean, so we have, a really nice story, and it was actually a story from a pediatric patient. And, again, most of our industry, we know that, when obviously children are involved and pediatric patients involved, it tugged at your heart. And we had an experience with particularly a muscular dystrophy patient who was definitely willing. The parents and the caregivers had decided that participating in a clinical trial was certainly the right option and the right direction for their family. And because of the actual difficulties with traveling and the immobility that patient experienced, and not only but the inconvenience that traveling from their home where they resided to the actual site, which was as I recall, I think it was roughly 4 to 6 hours away. We were able to, get engaged, and ultimately through working with the sponsor, working directly very closely with the PI and the research teams and their staff, we were able to identify a way in which we can provide much of the services. Again, a lot of the clinical procedures that were needed and historically done at the site could be done, safely in the patient's home. And so by doing so, that patient was able to participate in a clinical trial. And actually, it was a beautiful story that one of our industry groups or patient advocacy groups, I recall that patient shared a beautiful story about, and the parents sharing a beautiful story of that patient being able to participate in the trial and what it meant to them from an empowerment standpoint. And more importantly, the hope for a discovery of a therapy or a treatment was really one of the underlying reasons for participating.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great, more personalized example that I think people can really relate to. And like you said, nothing motivates most of our teams like a pediatric, effort. So yeah, that's great. I think, I'd love to hear more, like building off of that. Just if I'm a sponsor and I've caught the buzzword and I understand that decentralized trials is something I should be thinking about, but I've never done it before. How do I start? What do I think about?
Yeah, no. So there's so many considerations. And so one of the things that we like to do as a consultative approach is to engage your particular, service advisors, your collaborators, whether it's your CROs or technology providers, engage them earlier so that they can opine and provide consultative solutions on helping you think about digital endpoints, helping you think about the operational complexity, helping you think about looking at the schedule of events and looking at the procedures and seeing where, again, many of the traditional procedures can be done, whether it's mobile phlebotomy or in-home nursing. And so what I would strongly recommend is as you think about decentralized clinical trials, is to contact organizations like Reveles, and there are many organizations that are actually really spurring our industry on, whether it's a technology a technology provider, or there are technology and service providers like Reveles. I would say, engage these organizations. And I think secondary, I would say, really begin to think about the patients. I think, often, we designed the clinical trial. We've spent, a lot of energy crafting a protocol, and we often miss how important it is to go back and to talk to the patients, particularly with rare disease, complex diseases. I would strongly encourage you to reach out to, those groups, the patient advocacy groups, begin to engage them, understand, their odyssey, how the trial can be incorporated into their lifestyle. What is the disease manifestation? What are some of the burdens that are placed on that trial, on that patient, so that you can, again, have a more informed and more patient-centric protocol. which often will lend itself to including an element of, the decentralized clinical trial approach. And then last but not least is, just make sure that, you begin to think about, what are all of the different levels of complexity, from regulatory requirements to quality oversight to that is needed to ensure a successful decentralized clinical trials. And so, at Reveles, we do take this matter very seriously, because we understand that at this particular junction, our industry is looking for insights and direction. And so we've created a tool called the Reveles DCT Grader, where we can help sponsors that are ultimately evaluating their trials fit for decentralized clinical trials. We can help provide them with ultimately a tool that'll help guide them around the right direction and how to think about their trial and their organizational fit, which is equally important.
Yeah, that's great. Like really helping them figure out what options they have and how their trial works. I heard you say a couple things. Like in some ways, it's a really interesting. In the duration of my career, it's almost like how far we've come. Right? It used to be, don't forget to think about the sites when you're crafting your protocol. Right? You'd sit in a room and you'd put all the science in, and then you'd send it to the sites, and they would say, "Wow, I can't execute that. It's so very difficult." And now with all the technology and all the evolution, we're talking about patients in their homes and how to make the protocol, executable for them. So in some ways it's, look how far we've come, how fast, even though sometimes it feels, so slow.
Hey,
Can
Kelly,
you tell me?
go
Go ahead.
I
Yeah.
want to touch on that, because I think that's such an important part. The site, the principal investigator and the clinical research site, I actually think, with the all of the sensationalism and the sizzle around decentralized clinical trials, I think the sites are the stakeholders that are often forgotten, because again, a lot of the confusion around virtual and siteless. But we at Reveles believe that the site plays a critical role in the ecosystem of clinical development. And so I think making sure that the sites clearly understand their role, what aspects of decentralized clinical trials what the principal investigators oversight. Often when you're using a decentralized clinical trial approach, you're leveraging local home health care providers. These providers are probably in many regards great at providing care. They often don't have extensive research experience. And so making sure that they're well trained on what is expected from a regulatory and compliance and data quality is important. But more importantly, making sure that the site is equipped and that they have the level of transparency that is needed to feel comfortable about those activities being extended as an extension of the site's great work. And so, again, wasn't my intent, but I do think, the site is, often overlooked and should not be. The sites that certainly play a critical role and will continue to play a critical role in the clinical development process.
Yeah, that's a great point. That they need to have that transparency to feel comfortable with some of what they're traditionally responsible for being extended so far out past their control. Does take a lot of preparation and a lot of transparency. So yeah, that's really worthy point of revisiting. If we kind of keep going on decentralized trials, this is really just the beginning, right? So I guess, since you're really rooted in it and this is your passion and your experience, like, where do you see decentralized trials going? What's the near term and the far term look like for all of us?
I am, Kelly, I'm incredibly bullish about what the future has for our industry with the adoption to decentralized clinical trials. I think there was a recent survey that said that as a result of COVID-19, nearly 36% of the clinical trials had been modified to include decentralized clinical trial approaches. I think, I'm recalling another industry survey. I think it was close to nearly 2/3 of the industry said that they would be strongly considering incorporating decentralized clinical trials approaches in their study design. So I think the industry is very excited. I think largely the paradigm and the general position has shifted from, you know, decentralized clinical trials used to be viewed as a innovation. Now it's a risk mitigation strategy with, many sites still being inaccessible, many sites still being, having increased burden placed on them from the level of complexity with trials, lack of qualified sites, the competitive nature of recruiting patients. So I think decentralized clinical trials and all of its advantages will continue to spur our industry forward. And so I'm incredibly bullish about it. I'm excited about the proliferation of these digital health assets and integrated technologies. I think, unlike many industries where there is a transformation, your regulatory bodies are often 5 to 6 years behind. This isn't a case with clinical development and research. We see where the FDA is really out front, and the leadership are broadly endorsing decentralized clinical trials as a way to provide a more patient-centric clinical trial and how it ties into the Modernization of Clinical Trials Act. So we have the right momentum as an industry. I think we need to continue to think about societal factors such as, patients are becoming more, engaged. They're increased in their overall kind of consumerism. They want to be engaged and empowered. They're no longer just data providers. They want to know how the data is going to be used, and they are taking certainly an active role. So you just think about, again, the advancements around technology solutions, societal factors. We still have uncertainty, global uncertainty around COVID-19. I think all of these uniquely position decentralized clinical trials is certainly a way to facilitate the continuation of clinical trials activity.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. It crystallizes the opportunity when you face the challenges of the pandemic. And like you said, it pushes us past the site because we can't get to the site anymore. And this research has to continue because underneath, I think everybody's just passionate about bringing solutions to these patients. So I really appreciate all of your insight and you sharing all of these wonderful points. How can people find Reveles?
Well, yes. So we certainly would love for people to reach out to us. Again, as an emerging company, we often have to deal with the fact that we're not a household name, but soon to be more recognized for the care and the service we provide. But yes, you can directly, visit us at our website at www.revelesclinical.com. We can also be connected on LinkedIn. We'd love to connect and value connecting with other life science and clinical development leaders. So LinkedIn, we do have a Reveles Clinical Services page. Please, like us and subscribe to our blogs. We're really, as an organization, have established that we want to continue to be a thought leader around decentralized clinical trials and helping educate the industry and helping inform and really, address some of the lack of clarity around what decentralized clinical trial approaches are. And then last but not least, we have a DCT grader that is a tool that's on our website. And that tool, again, is to help sponsors and other life science leaders that are evaluating decentralized clinical trials. The intent of that tool really is to provide a resource to help you think about the different aspects of the trial design, as well as the organizational fit. And I think they're equally as important, which is, designing for the protocol, designing the trial, but also is the organization in a place where they're, willing to move forward with decentralized clinical trial approaches, and in which you'll get a rating of sorts that'll tell you your overall fit for and readiness. And again, we would love to be engaged. And if there's any, if there's anyone that's interested in speaking with me directly, I can be reached at arches.starling@revelesclinical.com.
Great. Appreciate that. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Conversations in Clinical Trial Readiness. If you're interested in learning more about our team, head to our website, ArcheMedX.com, or follow us on LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us.